Everyone knows the Trans-Canada Highway. It's been celebrated since 1962 as the road that finally stitched this country together. All 7,121 kilometres of it, coast to coast, province to province. A ribbon of asphalt that says, "We are one nation, and here is the proof." But I drove it, the whole thing, and what I found along the way is something no tourism board is going to put on a poster. There are places along that highway, towns, communities, entire chapters of Canadian life, that the road passes without acknowledgment. No signs, sometimes not even a name on the map anymore. And the further west you go, the heavier it gets. Not because the landscape gets darker, but because you start to realize the highway didn't just connect things, it also chose what to leave behind. This is the story of 14 of those places, in the order I found them, from St. John's to Victoria. What the Trans-Canada doesn't tell you about itself. The highway doesn't actually reach Marachine. You have to take a ferry to get there. A short crossing into Placentia Bay, into a silence that feels like it belongs to a different era entirely. But Marachine is where this story has to begin, because it captures something that echoes all the way across the country. Marachine was a fishing community, generations of families, a church, a school, a wharf that had been there longer than anyone could remember. And then, in 1969, the Newfoundland government decided it was more efficient to consolidate communities, to move people off the smaller islands and onto the mainland. They called it the resettlement program. It was framed as progress, opportunity, a better future. The families of Marachine were relocated. They took what they could carry. Some of them literally floated their houses across the bay on barrels, dragging the only walls they'd ever known to a place they'd never chosen. What stayed behind was the shape of a community without its people, the outlines of foundations, a cemetery that no one visits regularly enough, the bay itself, which doesn't care. There's something about starting a cross-country journey here that recalibrates everything. Because before you even get to the highway proper, you've already met the first version of a story you're going to keep encountering. The story of a community that was told its disappearance was for its own good. Marachine is still on the maps, most of them anyway. The last permanent resident left within the past decade. The maps haven't caught up yet. The Trans-Canada pushes you through Nova Scotia fast. The road wants you moving, always. But Canso is the kind of place that pulls at you if you let yourself slow down. It was one of the oldest continuously operating fishing ports in North America. French, English, Indigenous, layers of history pressed into a small stretch of coastline. At its peak, the fishery supported an entire regional economy. Processing plants, supply chains, families that had fished the same waters for 6 generations. Then the cod collapsed. Not gradually, catastrophically. The 1992 moratorium on northern cod didn't just shut down an industry. It ended a way of life that had existed for centuries. Overnight, communities like Canso lost not just jobs, but the entire architecture of their daily existence. What's strange about Canso now is that it still looks from a distance like a functioning town. There's a gas station, a few houses with lights on, a harbor. But the processing plant has been quiet for decades, and the population has dropped to a fraction of what it was. The people who stayed, and some did stay deliberately, stubbornly, live in a place that was hollowed out by an event that happened hundreds of meters offshore. You pass Canso, and it looks fine. That's the thing. It looks fine. Quebec has its own relationship with economic abandonment, and Lachute is one of the cleaner examples of what happens when a railway town loses its railway. The line through Lachute was a lifeline, not just for moving goods, but for the identity of the town itself. Rail towns in Canada developed a particular kind of self-understanding. The train meant you were connected, you mattered, you were on the route. When the line was deactivated, when the company decided the economics no longer made sense, something more than a transportation link was severed. What makes Lachute odd, and I mean odd in a way that stays with you, is that the tracks are still there. They didn't remove them. There's no obvious reason they're still sitting there, rusting in some sections, just running alongside roads and through the edges of town like a sentence that was never finished. Like the infrastructure is waiting for a decision that's decades overdue. A town without its railway is a town that was promised permanence and received impermanence instead. The people who stayed built around that absence. The downtown shifted. Businesses closed and some reopened as something else, something unrelated to whatever the original purpose was. It adapted, but the tracks are still there, and they don't let you forget what it was adapting from. There's a moment, driving along the St. Lawrence in Ontario, where you start to notice that something about the landscape feels slightly off. The towns sit just a little too far from the water. The streets in some places have a geometry that doesn't quite match the terrain. It takes a beat to register what you're actually looking at. Iroquois was moved, the entire town. In the 1950s, the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway required the flooding of a significant stretch of river shoreline. Several communities were in the way. The governments involved, Canadian and American, federal and provincial, made a decision: relocate the towns rather than abandon them. So Iroquois was physically relocated. Buildings were lifted, transported, and set down in a new location a few kilometers inland. The town you can visit today is not where the town was. It's a copy, placed on different ground, with different coordinates, after an act of infrastructure so large it reshaped the river itself. The original Iroquois is underwater. There are days when water levels drop and the outlines of the old streets become faintly visible beneath the surface. A grid, barely there, a ghost that surfaces when conditions allow. People live in Iroquois today. They shop at the grocery store. They drive the same streets. But the ground beneath them is borrowed. The real town is somewhere else, 30 feet down, visible only when the river decides to show it. There's a version of Saskatchewan that the Trans-Canada shows you. Flat, open, enormous skies, grain elevators on the horizon like punctuation marks. It's real. But there's another Saskatchewan, the north, where the story gets stranger. Uranium City sits in the far north of the province, near Lake Athabasca. It boomed after the Second World War when uranium mining became suddenly, urgently important. The federal government needed uranium. Uranium City delivered. At its height, it had several thousand residents, schools, a hospital, a hotel, an airport, a full, functioning city in a place that by any geographic logic shouldn't have had one. The mine closed in 1982. Within months, the population went from roughly 2,000 people to about 100. The decline wasn't gradual, it was a near total evacuation. The government-provided housing was sold off or abandoned. Businesses closed. The airport stayed open only because the road out was insufficient to handle the remaining population. What stayed is hard to describe without seeing it. Buildings standing fully intact but empty. A town site that looks like someone pressed pause in 1982 and never came back to press play. The people who remain, and there are some, mostly Indigenous residents who had been there long before the boom, live in a landscape of frozen time, surrounded by infrastructure built for a city that evaporated. There's something that happens when you realize a government built an entire city for resource extraction and then simply stopped caring about it the moment the resource ran out. Uranium City didn't collapse. It was abandoned. The distinction matters. If Uranium City shows you what happens when a resource town collapses fast, Lynn Lake shows you what slow collapse looks like. It was a nickel mining community, established in the early 1950s. The mine kept going longer than most, long enough that generations grew up there, built families, built an identity around the town. When production finally wound down, it happened over years, not overnight, and that gradual process created a different kind of wreckage. What's left in Lynn Lake is the infrastructure of optimism. Schools built for a population that never came back to fill them. A recreation center that once hosted hockey tournaments from across northern Manitoba, now mostly quiet. Houses that were built solid, because people thought they'd be there forever, standing empty in rows. The most unsettling thing about Lynn Lake isn't the abandonment, it's the houses. Actual houses built for families, sitting empty in a grid pattern. Porch lights sometimes on because of automatic timers. as if waiting for someone to come home. The people who stayed, and some did, are remarkably clear-eyed about what happened. They don't romanticize it. They say, the mine left, and so did everything that depended on the mine. What they don't say, but what sits in the air when you talk to them, is the other part, and nobody outside of here noticed. This one requires a small geographic digression, because Flin Flon is one of those places that simply shouldn't exist. And yet it does, defiantly, straddling the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan in a way that makes no administrative sense and somehow works anyway. But Creighton, the Saskatchewan side of this strange twin city, tells a particular story about what happens when the mine that built you starts winding down. The zinc and copper operation that defined Flin Flon for decades is contracting, slowly, persistently. And Creighton, the smaller, less commercially developed side of the equation, is feeling it first. There's a shopping mall on the Manitoba side that serves the whole region. On the Saskatchewan side, storefronts that used to be something else now have signage in the windows that no longer matches what's inside, or nothing inside at all. The economic gravity is shifting, has been shifting for years, and the people who can feel it most are the ones watching their side of the border quietly hollow out while the other side, for now, holds on. What strikes you about border towns in decline is the way decline respects no jurisdiction. The invisible line in the middle of the street means nothing to an economy that's contracting. Canmore gets mentioned in travel guides as a charming mountain town, a gateway to the Rockies, the more affordable alternative to Banff. And it is those things. But just outside of Canmore, in the Bow Valley, there are remnants, quiet, easily missed, of coal mining operations that once defined the entire region. The thing about the Bow Valley coal communities is that most of them didn't make it to the tourist economy era. Bankhead, right next to Banff, was a functioning coal town inside what became a national park, and the park eventually absorbed it, dismantled it, erased it. What's left is a walking trail with interpretive signs where a town of 1,000 people once stood. Nearby, in the hills, you can find the remnants of other operations. Coke ovens, built to process coal into industrial fuel, standing in the forest like ancient ruins. Except they're not ancient, they're 20th century. Some of them were operating within living memory. The mountains are so beautiful that it becomes easy to forget what was extracted from them and what that extraction cost. Canmore survived by reinventing itself completely. The communities that couldn't do that, they're in the trees. You have to know to look. The Crow's Nest Pass deserves its own documentary, maybe its own series. But for now, just this. It is one of the most layered stretches of the Trans-Canada Corridor in terms of industrial history, disaster, and slow disappearance. In 1903, a massive rockslide killed somewhere between 70 and 90 people in the town of Frank. The entire face of Turtle Mountain collapsed onto the town in the middle of the night, burying homes, a mine, and a section of railway under millions of tons of limestone in about 90 seconds. The slide is still there. You can see it from the highway, an enormous field of pale rock, broken and still, right next to the road. It looks geological. It is geological. But it's also a mass grave. Frank didn't disappear entirely after the slide. The remaining residents rebuilt nearby. But the towns of the pass, Frank, Blairmore, Coleman, Bellevue, spent decades after the slide trying to sustain themselves on coal mines that kept closing one by one through the mid-20th century. What you get driving through the Crow's Nest today is a strange layering of time. The slide is there, immovable, permanent. Next to it, a small museum. Next to that, a Tim Hortons. Life proceeding at normal speed alongside one of the most violent geological events in Canadian recorded history. Nobody looks at it wrong. That's the strangest part. It just sits there, by the road, and everyone keeps driving. Cache Creek sits at a junction, literally and figuratively. The Trans-Canada meets Highway 97 here, and for a period, this was a significant stop, a place where truckers, travelers, and supply routes converged. It had the energy of a crossroads town, motels, diners, fuel, the particular kind of commerce that gets built around movement. Then the Coquihalla Highway opened in 1986. It was faster, more direct. Traffic patterns shifted. The trucks rerouted. The cars took the new road. Cache Creek went from crossroads to bypass, almost overnight. The motel signs are still up. Some of the motels are still technically open. But the parking lots are mostly empty now, and the kind of steady traffic that used to sustain the main strip has thinned to something occasional. A town that was built on being in the way, in the best possible sense, discovered that roads change, and when they do, the towns that depended on them don't always get a warning. There's a specific sadness to a roadside town that outlived its road. The infrastructure is there, the intent is visible, but the purpose relocated without telling anyone. Lytton is different, not a slow decline story, something more sudden, more devastating, and more recent. In June of 2021, Lytton recorded the highest temperature ever measured in Canadian history, 49.6 degrees Celsius. The next day, a wildfire swept through the town in minutes. Almost the entire community was destroyed. The evacuation happened so fast that people left with almost nothing. The confluence of the Fraser and Thompson rivers at Lytton was a significant site long before any colonial town was built there. It was a major trading and gathering place for Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The land at that junction carries a history far longer than the history of the town that burned. What's happening in Lytton now, the slow, contested, complex process of trying to rebuild, is a story about what a community decides it is when the physical structure of that community is gone. Who rebuilds? What they rebuild? Whether the identity survives when the buildings don't. When I drove past the town site, the debris had been largely cleared. What was left was an open space where a town used to be. Just empty lots and the sound of the rivers. It's one thing to drive past a place that declined over decades. This was different. This was a town that was present, and then was not present, in the span of an afternoon. There's a stretch of the Trans-Canada through the Fraser Valley where you pass through or near multiple Stolo First Nation communities, communities that have been in this valley for thousands of years, communities that the highway acknowledges with essentially no signage, no interpretation, no recognition. The Trans-Canada runs through territory that has a human history stretching back at least 10,000 years. And the highway, in its signage and its infrastructure, presents itself as if that history either doesn't exist or isn't relevant to the drive. What strikes you isn't hostility, it's absence. The highway simply doesn't talk about it. The signs point to rest stops, to cities, to provincial parks. The deep Indigenous history of the land the road is built on is invisible by design, or at least by omission, which might be the same thing. There are communities along this stretch, some prosperous, some struggling, some in the middle of land negotiations that have been ongoing for decades, and the road passes all of them without a word. You could drive the Trans-Canada end to end and come away with almost no sense that Indigenous peoples have a continuous, living, present-tense existence in the places the highway crosses. That's not an accident of oversight. That's a choice embedded in the road itself. Hope is the last real town before the Rockies from the west. It sits where the Fraser River Valley starts to narrow, where the mountains close in, where the geography becomes something you feel in your chest. And Hope has a history that most people driving through don't know. It was a significant fur trade post, a gold rush gateway, a place that attracted waves of people looking for something just beyond the next ridge. Over time, it settled into a quieter existence, a service town, a place to stop, a community that functioned without much attention from the rest of the country. What Hope holds now, without quite broadcasting it, is a concentration of social challenges that would be recognizable in many small resource-dependent communities across British Columbia. Poverty, addiction, the slow population drain as younger people move to the city, an Indigenous population that has been there longer than the town by centuries, navigating all of it with less support than the situation requires. From the highway, Hope looks beautiful. The mountains are right there. The river is right there. It looks like somewhere you'd want to stop, take a photo, maybe have lunch. And maybe you do all those things. But the town that the highway shows you, and the town that the people who live there inhabit. Those are two different places, occupying the same geography. There's a section of the Trans-Canada between Golden and Revelstoke, through Rogers Pass, that is considered one of the most spectacular drives in the country. Genuinely. The mountains here are enormous in a way that recalibrates your sense of scale. Glaciers, snowfields, a road that climbs and drops through terrain that, not long ago, was considered essentially impassable. But what that stretch of highway doesn't tell you is what it cost to build it, and what it buried in the process. Rogers Pass was the killing field of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Avalanches killed somewhere between 200 and 250 workers during the construction era. Some estimates go higher. The men were mostly immigrants, Chinese workers who were paid a fraction of what white workers received, Canadians from across the country, laborers from Europe. They died under snow, under rock, in conditions that the companies building the railway were aware of and judged acceptable. When the Trans-Canada was built through the same pass decades later, the same avalanche terrain had to be managed with a system of concrete shelters, snow sheds, and artillery-triggered controlled releases. The engineering is extraordinary. But the reason the engineering exists is because the ground beneath it is the ground where hundreds of men were buried and often never recovered. You drive through that pass, the views are undeniable, and somewhere under the snowfields is the uncollected evidence of what it took to build the road you're driving on. The Trans-Canada is, in some ways, a monument to endurance and ambition. It spans a country. It is genuinely impressive, but it is also a road built over the places and people it required to exist, and it drives smoothly enough that you'd never have to think about that if you didn't want to. I drove from St. John's to Victoria, every kilometre, and what I found is that the Trans-Canada is exactly what they say it is, a road that connects a country. But connection, it turns out, is not the same as inclusion. The highway passes through an enormous amount of absence. Towns that were built on single industries and left to manage their own obsolescence when those industries moved on. Communities that were physically relocated to make room for infrastructure. Indigenous histories that the road crosses without acknowledgment. Places that existed fully and then stopped existing, or exist now only partially, or exist only in the memory of the people who were there. The road keeps moving. That's what roads do. They don't look back, they don't slow down, they don't stop to account for what they've passed. But someone should.